So now that we're looking at what types of things are found in each one of the zones, we are going to look a little bit here at how to place these zones and more or less how they're going to look in real life as opposed to concentric circles. I'm going to draw a little bit of an example here for you of some sort of typical broad acre lot. So you'd have your house and maybe your zone 2 looks like this, and your zone 3 might be here, and you might also have another patch of zone 3 up here, and you might have zone 4 that looks like this, and maybe this part here too is another part of zone 4, and the rest of it is zone 5. So as you can see here, this really does not just look like a bunch of circles. And the reason being is that the slope in the landscape itself is going to determine a lot of how these zones are shaped. So perhaps maybe this zone 5 right here that's really quite close to the house, although in proximity it's really close, maybe it is an extremely steep valley. So you wouldn't be able to use it for crops or anything like that, or maybe it's the type of forest where you just wouldn't necessarily have your cattle grazing in there. Maybe it's all pine trees. It's hard to say. Maybe it's already a forest that you don't want to destroy. So it's already very natural land that's absolutely beautiful that you do not want to turn into something else. There's a lot of possibilities as to why things might be grouped the way that they're grouped. So most of these situations are going to be determined by slope or orientation. So there might be situations where you might have bands of zone 4 running through zone 3 because it might involve a bunch of water harvesting, for example. Zone 2, when you are looking at height, zone 2 plants are typically a lot higher than zone 1 plants. So maybe you don't want zone 2 type plants directly to the south of zone 1 because it might provide too much shade. So you might want to move those zone 2 plants somewhere else. So these really are not concentric circles at all. Very often, zone 4 can even be used as a boundary between yourself and something undesirable. So maybe you'll insert, let's say that there is something very unsightly over here, or maybe there's a highway running through right here that is extremely busy. Then perhaps what you'll end up doing with your design is you might end up with a large band of zone 4 where you've got a bunch of forest planted deliberately to block yourself from the noise and the unsightliness of the highway. So zone 5 is often already forest that we don't want to modify or destroy. It's typically discussed as forest, but for me, coming from the prairies, to me, it's also just a lot of native prairie that we don't want to disrupt as well. So it's a lot of natural grass areas and things like that. It doesn't necessarily have to be treed. It just needs to be a wild area that we don't want to disturb in any way, shape, or form. So the contour might also make lines change as well. So the way that the slope changes in different areas. Windbreaking in different capacities could also make bands of zone 4 going off into other zones too, because zone 4 is typically tall trees. So you might end up with a lot of it in strange places just so that you're blocking a lot of the wind. So when we're looking at different situations here too, if we've got our house in here, and this is our zone 1, I don't know why it has a tail, but there we go. If we have our house in zone 1, we might choose to put our zone 2 to the north, because if the south is here and this is where our sun is coming from, like I was saying with the taller trees, it wouldn't really make much sense to put zone 2 here and shade our house too much. So instead, we might put a block of zone 3 here, which is more like pasture land and main crop and things like that. And then outside of that, if we wanted a little bit of privacy, perhaps from some neighbors that were living over here as well, then we could put in a band of zone 4 just to be able to kind of block a lot of the undesirable views. And then maybe we had a bunch of wilderness over here. So as you can see, there's a lot of different placements and arrangements and ways that things might actually be produced. So when we're looking at the bands of trees for wind blocking, this is not a great example for where I live because the wind never comes from the northeast, but let's say that the wind comes from the northeast where you live, then perhaps what you would have is maybe this zone 4 comes up here, and maybe you have a band of zone 4 that comes in to, I'm sorry, that doesn't block the wind at all from the northeast, does it? So in this case, maybe you're trying to block the wind from here, and the wind is coming from the northwest. I didn't really think that one through before I started drawing it. So if the wind is coming from this direction, you might want to choose to put a band of zone 4 in here to protect some of these trees. You kind of get the idea that you can move a lot of these zones in depending on what you need. Maybe you have a lot more cattle than a lot of other people and then they all need to be milked. Then this large fence line right along zone 1 makes a lot of sense because you have a lot of room for them to come up and for you to access them and to take care of them as well. So this moves us into an example of maybe a smaller acreage and how it might look when you're looking at the zones. Now, obviously not all properties are rectangles either, but for demonstrative purposes, I will be just drawing a rectangle. So in a smaller acreage, you might end up having your house here in zone 1. You might end up having zone 2 more or less coming in like this so that it doesn't block the sun again. And maybe there isn't a zone 3 on this property. Maybe you don't have any cattle. Maybe you don't have any goats. Very often zone 3 is the zone that is the most commonly left out of designs because not everybody wants grazing animals or a main crop that takes a lot of effort for resale or anything like that. And then you may have forest here up at the top and the rest of it might just be wilderness. So on a smaller acreage, you might have less zones, some zones omitted, things like that. No two zone maps are ever going to be the same. We can all look at the exact same property and come up with an infinite amount of variations on how the zones are going to be placed. So as long as we look at what typically belongs in each zone and how frequently we have to visit everything, those are just the main points behind a lot of this. So if we're looking at an urban lot, it's going to look much different than when we're looking at a farm. So in an urban lot, your house is going to be taking up a lot of the property. This is just a ridge line on my house. I don't know why I keep drawing that. It doesn't really make it look more like a house, but you get the idea that this is the house inside the urban lot. And perhaps maybe in this particular example, there may only be a zone 1 and a zone 2, but we might still have an expression of zone 5. So maybe we would like a little corner in the back of our yard that feels kind of wild, that we could go and sit in with a book and it feels a little bit more overgrown and a little bit more like wilderness. So although it's not completely wild and untouched by us, we can create something that kind of has that feel to it as well. And so maybe you don't want an annual garden, maybe you just want a bunch of perennials. So perhaps the outside of your yard here is just zone 2. So it's just plants that you do need to care for from time to time, but they mostly grow on their own. And then perhaps the rest of the yard is patio area, maybe a really small little vegetable garden somewhere. That would all be zone 1. This might be walking paths around, there might be some front steps, there might be a basketball net out here. So basically this area here is all going to be, it's a horrible basketball net. This whole area here might have a lot less expressions of a bunch of other zones because it's not going to have a forest, and it's not like for timber trees, and it's probably not going to have a steep valley in it or something like that. A very popular way to design yards back during World War II actually involved switching zones 1 and zone 2 periodically for the most amount of production and fertility that was possible. So what was kind of common then was that they would have a little chicken coop in the backyard. So maybe their house was up here, and they would have 2 sections. So they would have a little door for the chickens on this side and a little door for the chickens on this side, and then these 2 areas would be fenced. And they could choose which of these doors they wanted to open. So what they would do is one year they would have this as zone 1 as their annual garden, and this would be zone 2 where the chickens would go out and run and scratch and fertilize and manure this place up and eat all the scraps and everything like that. Then the next year they would switch these 2. So they would close up this door and they would open this door, and they would plant on this side and they would put their chickens on this side. And it was a very efficient way of fertilizing the ground and making really good use of your space using the chickens that you had on hand. In a lot of urban areas, there is space in between a sidewalk and the street. Especially, there's a lot of that in Canada. I don't know if I've seen a lot of it in the States, but definitely in Canadian cities, there's a lot more of that where the land is mostly, it's city property, but you're kind of responsible for maintaining it. So you're responsible for cutting the grass if there's grass there. It's not really your land, but there's still an extra strip that can be planted. So very often you can use that strip as a zone 2. You could plant something like a food forest there, or some edible perennials or something like that in that area. And there are very few examples of times when people would complain about that. And it just gives you a little bit extra buffer, a little bit more planting area as well. And very often it's more just a bylaw as to whether or not you can plant on there. So if you get the approval of your neighbors and your neighbors seem fine with it, then typically you can plant in those strips. I've also seen it happen a lot in behind people's houses where there's, what's the word for it? An easement. If there's just like a grass easement in behind houses, very often people will have a garden just outside their own fence line. And I know people that have had gardens out there for 20 or 30 years without anybody complaining. And I guess worst case scenario, if somebody complains about your annual garden outside of your property, then you rip it out. But we can very often get quite creative with trying to find extra space just outside of our properties as well. When we look at the size ratio of a lot of these zones, the size of how big the zones are and all of that kind of stuff, it's all dependent on how much human energy we have at the center of the design. So in my case, where I made my garden way too big in zone 1, it wasn't to scale because I am one human and I only have so much energy. Now that my boys are getting a lot older and can help out, that garden can possibly expand a little bit because now I have 5 people's energy that's going into it. Or if I was to employ someone to come and help out with it, then it can be sized accordingly as well. But it's just very important to not go too big too soon. And it is quite possibly the number one mistake that most people make when they first get land, is they want everything set up right now. And it is a lot better to start off slow, and then when you have extra energy, then expand things out as opposed to going the other direction.